My name is Lawrence Rosenberg, and this is the Alpha Human Podcast. Today's guest is Jay Feldman. Jay is an independent researcher, health coach, and in my opinion, one of the most knowledgeable advocates of the bioenergetic approach to health. Jay's also the host of the Energy Balance Podcast, a show that's dedicated to diving deep into the bioenergetic and pro-metabolic positions on diet, nutrition, health, and fitness. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Lawrence. I'm happy to be here.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. The reason that I was keen to have a conversation with you is that almost 8 years ago now, I was diagnosed with cancer. They found a monster tumor on my left kidney, size of a grapefruit. And we had that sucker ripped out along with the left kidney. And then I went to manage it. I went on a ketogenic diet. That's right. Like I dove deep into the research. I'm going to conquer this. I'm going to kick the hell out of it. I'm going to overcome. And so deep in my research, as I'm sure you're aware, you're gonna start finding all the literature and all the influencers and all the information out there on how a ketogenic diet can potentially manage cancer. So I went deep on that. From there, it progressed into a carnivore diet. So that was kind of like the evolution, starting at keto, like real keto, like 80% keto, 20%, 80% fat, 20% protein. Moved into carnivore. And from carnivore, I was on that for a while, moved into carnivore plus intermittent fasting. So one meal a day, and that one meal was steak, man, right? Like that, I'm talking years. So all of this lasts for about 6.5 years, at which point I introduced some carbs to my diet. Never more than 20 grams a day, so it's really not a lot of carbs, but a little bit from nuts, a little bit from like super low sugar fruits like strawberries. Then I came across a study on the type of cancer I had, which is called chromophobe renal cell carcinoma, which is a rare form of kidney cancer. So the most popular, if that's the right word, but the most prevalent form of kidney cancer is clear cell renal cell carcinoma. Makes up about 85% of all kidney cancers. The one I got makes up only 5% of kidney cancers. And the unique thing about this cancer and a few others, I found in this study that chromophobe renal cell carcinoma does not, unlike other cancers, upregulate the metabolism of glucose. It does not upregulate amino acid metabolism. It does not upregulate fatty acid metabolism. No upregulation of gluconeogenesis. So how is this cancer feeding itself? It turns out, all the typical hallmarks of cancer metabolism are not present in this type of cancer. Chromophobe cancer uses the autophagic process as its nutrient supply chain, right? So it's cannibalizing all the dead and senescent and broken cells. That's where it gets its nutrients, its substrate from. And so all of a sudden, I thought, my God, for all these years, I've been staying away from sugar and carbs. And, in this particular cancer, it doesn't seem to necessarily matter. So I started adding some more carbs to my diet, all in the form of fructose, Jay. And then I started experiencing some health issues, and I'm not sure if it was related to all the additional fructose, and we're going to dive deeper into that a little bit later. But ultimately, I came across you. I came across your work, dove into your site, downloaded your Energy Balance Food Guide, which, by the way, is awesome, and it's free. And I listened to dozens of your podcasts, read a bunch of your articles, and really have started changing my view on carbs for staying healthy, for staying lean. And so I wanted to lay all of that out, kind of set the table, so to speak, put things in context, with respect to the questions that I'm going to ask you. They are coming from a place where I'm not looking to challenge you, because I believe in a lot of what you're putting out, a lot of your positions. So if the questions I'm going to ask are not meant as a challenge, they're meant to give my audience more a sense of why these things, why the positions that you take with the bioenergetic view of health, although so different from everything myself and a lot of my listeners follow, which is, again, low carb, keto, carnivore stuff. Why what you're doing is not only so different and unique to the, I guess, the zeitgeist of the alternative health scene, but actually makes a heck of a lot of sense when you can explain a lot of the dogma that people in the carnivore community and the ketogenic community kind of rely on, which I've relied on for years, which turns out to maybe not be true. So there it is. Wanted to put all that out. Does all that sound fair? Does all of it make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm excited to dive in.
Okay. So let's kick this off. If you're in the alternative health and fitness space, which is anything other than the mainstream food pyramid approach to diet, right? Then some of the most crucial elements of getting fit and healthy and strong revolve around fasting, low carb dieting. Keto is big business in this space, and carnivore diets are surging. Now, the bioenergetics or pro-metabolic approach to diet and nutrition, which you're an advocate of, you're a proponent of this, takes a completely different stance on a lot of these subjects, as well as mainstream nutrition dogma. So before we get into the weeds, let's first kind of just unpack bioenergetics. What the heck is bioenergetics? And what is the bioenergetic view of health? And by the way, who is Ray Peat, who appears to be the progenitor of this approach to health and nutrition?
Yeah, great. Yeah, great questions and a great starting place. And even to back up for a moment, I, spent quite a long time in the alternative health space. And, just over 10 years ago, I was doing low carb and ketogenic diets and cyclical ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting and doing all of these things that I think a lot of us find as what we're sold to is the holy grail in the alternative health space. And so I've been there. I'm very familiar with that thought process, that perspective, and that view of the body and human physiology. And as I'm sure we'll get at, it can be helpful to juxtapose that perspective, those counter arguments, so to speak, with the bioenergetic view, since that's where so many of us are coming from. And again, myself included, when I came across this perspective. So the bioenergetic view is the idea that the driver of our health is the availability of energy. We're talking about ATP produced in the mitochondria. And essentially, a lack of energy is what leads to degeneration. We have an inability to properly repair and regenerate our tissues. We end up with all sorts of issues. We end up with chronically high stress hormones and a decrease in our metabolic rate and our capacity for energy production. And so that is the kind of paradigm or the set of things that we see when we're talking about any sort of symptoms, anything from insomnia to a lack of energy at the gym to more, intense chronic health issues like autoimmune conditions and various others, neurodegenerative conditions, fatty liver, on and on, insulin resistance, all of that. And on the flip side, if we focus on restoring our capacity for effective energy production, effective ATP production, we can reverse these processes and basically not only have abundant energy for feeling energetic and having good cognitive function, but also good digestion, a well-functioning immune system, and all the other things that go with that, along with regeneration. And so that's kind of the very, very broad perspective. As you had mentioned, Dr. Ray Peat was a large proponent of this view and really created a lot of evolution in it and became the most well-known person who was putting this together in terms of diet, lifestyle, philosophy, politics, the whole, in a much broader spectrum than just, what should we be doing in terms of our nutrition based on this bioenergetic view. And he was building on, lots of researchers before him. The term bioenergetics was actually coined by Albert St. Georgi, who was a Nobel Prize winning, I don't remember if it was biologist or physiologist or chemist, or biochemist, but I believe in the 1970s, he had a book titled Bioenergetics, which was positing this idea that, and building on other researchers, that energy is the primary determinant of health. And basically, if we have the energy, we'll be able to function well, and then vice versa. And so what we can then do is look at anything else that we might be doing, anything in our internal or external environment, and determine whether or not it's going to benefit us based on how it's going to impact our ability for energy production. Is this something that's going to support us and allow us to produce more energy? Is this taking away our energy and instead increasing stress and causing adaptive processes that in the long term are going to reduce our energy production? And so we can look at diet in that way, and supplements and anything else. And when we do end up doing that, it takes us to a very different place from low carb and fasting and other very similar interventions. A lot of the hormesis-based interventions takes us to basically an opposite place, where not that necessarily those things can't have certain benefits, but we can achieve those benefits while also improving our metabolic state, as opposed to doing things that come at the cost of our energy. And I'm sure, as we'll get into, those sorts of approaches, while they have some benefits, have this inherent cost of reducing our energy production and availability long term.
That's a great overview. It's funny. I remember in the months after I was first diagnosed with cancer, and doing research into really how to take care of myself, how to manage this from a nutritional perspective. Fortunately, I've never had to take medication, any form of treatment, and I've really dialed in the nutrition aspect of this. And I remember coming across Ray Peat and reading all about PUFAs and what, and we'll get to this a little bit later. And this is going to be, PUFAs are going to be the least of our conversation. People can find out all about polyunsaturated fats on your site and in your podcast. But I was reading what he was talking about with polyunsaturated fats and fish, and I found it fascinating. And I was getting into it, and then we started getting into the carb stuff, and the high carb, and is the preferred fuel. And I was like, oh, I'm out, forget it, because I was already down the ketogenic rabbit hole. So after that, I never looked him up again. And it only started coming back when I found you. So, all right. So some of the sacred cows of the alternative health space, let's say the non-vegan alternative health space, right? Which I include, when I say alternative health, I include the primal community, ancestral, carnivore, Stone Age diet, caveman diet, warrior diet, right? All of these approaches, even though there's a fair bit of nuance amongst some of these approaches, they all kind of boil down to intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, low carb and no carb approach. Sugars are bad. That's a big one. Fruit is bad. Fructose is as bad or worse, right? And although I think everyone agrees on the polyunsaturated fats, the PUFAs in this community, except you might get some disagreement on the fish piece. But let's get into carbs first. That's the big one here. That's the big sacred cow we've got to tackle. As carbohydrates and sugars, turns out, might not just be a positive addition to the diet, but maybe as the abundant macronutrient and preferred fuel source, is probably one of the biggest differentiators between the bioenergetic approach and the rest of the alternative health space. So with that in mind, here's a quote from one of your articles, because I think it sums up a number of questions and points that I'd like to cover with you. So here's the quote. you say that most of the current recommendations regarding carbs versus fats are now favoring the low carb fat burning approach. This is supported by all sorts of nonsense, such as carbohydrates aren't essential to our diets. Carbohydrates cause blood sugar dysregulation. Burning fat leads to fat loss. And our ancestors didn't eat carbohydrates, among others. So let's get into this. Let's tackle each one of these, or most of these, starting with what many from the low carb carnivore community, including myself, would view as the biggest issue with the bioenergetics approach. How do we align the nature of carbohydrates as a preferential and perhaps superior energy source for optimal health with our evolutionary history, particularly considering the limited access that early humans likely had to abundant carbohydrate resources? For example, the well-known paleoanthropologist, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Mickey Bendor. So Mickey Bendor's research suggests that before the advent of agriculture, humans predominantly led a hyper-carnivorous lifestyle. The findings of his study, entitled "The Evolution of the Human Trophic Level During the Pleistocene," indicates that our ancestors' diet was mostly composed of animal sources, exceeding 70% of their total dietary intake. So this suggests that the average macro breakdown significantly favored proteins and fats over carbs. And given that our biologic and metabolic pathways would have evolved to optimize the high protein, high fat dietary framework, how do we reconcile the bioenergetics view that we emphasize carbs as our primary fuel source?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I think there are important challenges to the idea that that is even accurate. But even if it was, I think the place we want to start is that the right question to ask? So,
Okay.
and this is a question of basically genetics and evolution. So the question is essentially, should we base what we do now on what happened for the last 100,000, 200,000, 400,000 million years for our species? That's essentially what the question is coming from. And if in order for that to be the right question, what we would have to say is that our, and this is again, a much larger conversation, but at least we can introduce it. What we would have to say is our genetics is entirely random. And over time, we were in a certain environment, and the interaction between that and random genetics led to the improved fitness of people who did better in that environment. And so we have basically led to a population that is ideally suited for that environment.
Mm.
That's the idea. And so with that assumption, whatever that environment was should be ideal. And there are, I take some issue with that perspective genetically and evolutionarily, where instead what I would say is that there's a direct relationship between our environment and our genetics. It's a two-way interaction. And in that the driving force of health is not simply what did we do, but rather what led to the most abundant energy availability. And that doesn't mean that we don't have many adaptations to deal with periods of suboptimal energy availability, like, starvation, famine, going periods of time without food, going periods of time without carbohydrates. Of course, we have lots of mechanisms in place to be able to handle those times. That doesn't necessarily mean that exposing ourselves to those experiences is going to improve our health.
Mm.
And instead, the argument can be made that those things actually were preventing us from actualizing or improving as a species to the place that we could have gotten to actually complexifying further and improving our function. And in maybe as a way to kind of, again, extend an olive branch, like we talked about with PUFA, another thing that's often pointed to is 10,000 years ago when agriculture came around, we saw a decrease in stature and smaller brain size and things like that, right? And that's essentially this idea, right, that we provide a worse environment and it kind of holds us back. And I think you could essentially say, and obviously we don't know, and that's part of the problem, although there is different lines of evidence, or there are, but we could essentially say anytime that we were faced with a lack of carbs or faced with a lack of fuel or faced with excess exercise, those were things that led to the same thing that the agricultural evolution or revolution did, which was a restriction in our total capacity of function. So that is more so the perspective I would take. Obviously, there's different lines of evidence that point in that direction, but that is kind of the first differentiator that I would put out there, which is that if what I'm saying is actually accurate, then we aren't asking the right question. We shouldn't just be mimicking what we did prior. Now, that being said, let's assume that that is the right question and actually explore, okay, what was going on back then? Was it as simple as we didn't have carbs available? And there are a couple of things I would consider. So for one, we have our closest relatives are other apes, great apes. And when we look at our evolutionary lineage, not just looking at 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 100,000 years, but over millions of years, we have been pretty much isolated to very tropical regions of the world where it's basically summer-ish all year round. No winters, no cold, no snow, nothing like that, until about 30,000 years ago. That was about the time when we actually left tropical and kind of subtropical areas. And that's it. So that is a blip in the normal or in the entire timeline of our evolutionary past. So I think that's something that's worth considering as well, that during all that prior time, we would have been in places where there's fruit available year round and among other sources of carbohydrates. Now, when we look at our closest relatives currently that are living in those areas, if we look at the chimps, they have that environment, and their diet year round is between 60 and 100% fruit based. So there is no point during the year when they're eating less than 60% of their total, they're getting less than 60% of their total calories from fruit. And some of the year it's as much as 100%. So this idea that we wouldn't have had fruit available year round and we would have had all these winters and things like that really only would have been true in the last 30,000 years or so. Of course, there were periods of time when the entire globe was cooler, like ice ages. But during that time, you actually can see the migratory patterns of humans, and we condensed. We went closer and closer to the tropical areas as opposed to spreading out farther. We did everything we could to get back to warmth, which makes sense. It's a lot easier to survive in a warm climate, especially without modern technology. So those are, I think, a couple of things to consider just as starting points. And the last one I want to mention there is this idea that we have hybridized all the fruit, so now it has a lot of carbohydrates. In the past, it never did. It was all bitter and dense and basically it was depleted of carbohydrates. And that's true of some fruits, but not a lot of the ones that would have been available. And I'll just point to an article by Denise Minger, which is titled something about fruits not being small, dense, and bitter. I wish I remember the exact title, but I'm sure if you search for that, it'll come up, or we can reference it in the notes. Anyway, she basically kind of debunks this idea and talks about, and she was in the low carb camp at the time anyway, but debunks this idea that we wouldn't have had carbohydrate rich fruits available. So I think those are a few starting places or things to consider.
So just on that point, let me ask, because that was actually my next question about actually having the ability to tap that resource, right? And okay, say we were, let's say everyone will agree that for millions of years we evolved in tropical environments. I think everyone can agree on that. However, would we be able to process? Because, so again, the only access to carbs we really would have had would have been at minimum carrying as much fiber load as today's, probably more, because we've refined we've refined the fruits that we're eating. And if we're eating, certainly with root products like potatoes, but let's just stick with fruits, tropical. I would assume that at minimum the fiber load would be more, but would likely be the same, but probably more. Is it possible that Homo sapiens been around for 300,000 years roughly? We're not much different than we were 300,000 years ago. So could we actually process enough fruit with the fiber content that would give us a 3,000 calorie a day diet for your hunter-gatherer?
So not alone, right? I definitely think protein and fat were important as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that article from Denise Midger really shows that it's not a situation where these fruits were just all fiber and we were just getting, a gram or two of sugar out of them. But rather they were dense in carbohydrates, dense in sugar. So yeah, and you see, when we look throughout the apes, which are consuming, local fruits that are available in their area, they're not
Mm-hmm.
consuming our grapes from the store or something like that. They're getting massive amounts of sugar from these fruits, and there's also a very clear relationship between the amount of fruit consumed and brain size and intelligence in apes, where basically the more that they rely on fibers, from leaves and stems and very fibrous plant material, which then becomes short chain fatty acids in their guts. And they have more fermentation going on. The more they rely on those relative to fruits, the smaller their brain size, and vice versa. Where the ones with the larger brain size tend to be the ones consuming the most carbohydrate from fruits.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I could see that. In fact, there are a number of papers out there which link brain size to the amount of sugar we were getting in the diet, as opposed to what I think has been the prevalent theory amongst low carb community, which is that it was meat that drove meat and fat, which drove our development of larger brain size. But perhaps it was both, right? Perhaps it was, the access to meat and animal fat and uh, uh, glucose, sugar
Yeah.
that did it, right?
And honey as well is worth mentioning too. I mean, we can think of that as maybe a more minor one, but every tribal culture that we know of that has any sort of access to honey, meaning that they live on land, eats
Mhm.
honey when they can get it, and they go to pretty great lengths to get it. I think the only one that was identified that doesn't is ones that live like on the water on boats or something. But uh,
On
yeah,
boats.
so
I heard I heard your podcast talking about that one.
gotcha.
Yeah, no, great stuff. Okay. All right, so now let's tackle carbohydrates aren't essential to our diets. So from an article published by Cambridge University Press in the journal Nutrition Research Reviews entitled Application of Nutrient Essentiality Criteria to Dietary Carbohydrates. Dietary carbohydrates do not meet the criteria for nutritional essentiality because they are not required in the diet for growth, health, and survival, and whose absence leads to a deficiency, to disease or death. So essentially, what this article is stating is that when you consider essentiality uh, for a nutrient, it has its absence has to not lead to disease or death. But the thing I think I'm more interested in exploring, because I know the position would be, well, we don't want to just survive. Who the hell wants to just survive, right? We want to thrive. More importantly, you're a big proponent of optimization. So the thing that catches my eye here, and this is where I really want to hear your input on what's essential, is that they say that the reason dietary carbohydrates do not meet the criteria is because they are not required in the diet for growth, for health, and then survival. So we could just shunt survival aside. Let's talk about the fact that the View, and again, this isn't this is Cambridge University Press, right? It's a respected journal, and the narrative here is, hey, carbs aren't essential for growth. They're not essential for health, and their absence will not lead to deficiency or disease. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so there's an important distinction here, which is not that carbs are not essential, but dietary carbs are not essential, right? So
Okay.
and that's what this question is about. We're talking about dietary essentiality, meaning do we have to eat this to stay alive, to grow, all of that?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very different question from is this a nutrient that's needed? So, and as a really important uh, parallel here, saturated fats and monounsaturated fats are also not dietarily essential. We have zero need for them dietarily. We can consume 0 grams of each. We won't have any of the, we won't have any disease, won't have any health issue or any fat deficiency. The only fat that is considered to be essential is the polyunsaturated fats, the omega-6s and omega-3s. Whether they're actually essential is very questionable. The initial studies that were done on this is from the end of the 1920s, early 1930s by a couple of brothers, the Burr brothers. And they essentially, this was done at a time where there was a bunch of vitamins and minerals that weren't yet identified. And so they put these rats on a diet without any polyunsaturated fats, with no omega-6s actually was the focus, but no polyunsaturated fats. And they had issues. They didn't grow well. They had skin lesions, all sorts of problems. So they said, all right, these fats are essential.
Okay.
The studies were then redone less than a decade later. I think it was like 7 to 9 years later. And after the discovery of vitamin B6 and I believe zinc and their essentiality, and when those were provided, they couldn't recreate the issues developed by a so-called essential fatty acid deficiency. So that's like the base of that research. And there is some suggestion that maybe there's a minor amount of essentiality for omega-3s and omega-6s, but we're generally talking like 0.1 to 0.3% of our total diet. So we're talking very, very tiny amounts, maybe half a gram a day or something. So we can say, sure, half a gram a day of PUFA is essential. 0 grams of monounsaturated fat are essential. 0 grams of saturated fat are essential. 0 grams of carbohydrate are essential. On the protein side, we need to get some essential amino acids because we can't produce all of them. It's not that much, right? That if you calculate the total grams of essential amino acids needed that we can't, produce and just in order to function and have health. And if we were to base our diet off of that, it would be ridiculous, right? We would be eating half a gram of PUFA and some amino acids, maybe 30 grams of amino acids, and that would be our diet. So if we are what we should again, it's a situation where we're asking the wrong question. Whether something is essential doesn't tell us anything about what not only what's optimal or versus survival, but just what the question is dietary essentiality versus physiologic essentiality. And that's where things change because we need monounsaturated fats and saturated fats. And the same way we need carbohydrates, it's just that we can produce them. In the same way that we need lots of different amino acids, there's just a handful that we can't produce. So we have to get them from the diet. But just because we can produce these things doesn't mean that we should just rely on our own processes to produce them. I'm not saying that we should eat 0 grams of saturated fat because we can produce all the saturated fat we need. I would say that's a really ridiculous idea to base our diet off of. So that's really what the question is when it comes to dietary essentiality for carbohydrates. And in both cases, whether we're talking fats or carbs, just because there's zero essential doesn't mean we want to have zero in our diet.
I think what's potentially misleading about this is that its absence in the diet, right? Because we're talking dietary essentiality. So this paper is stating, and again, it's not just the paper; it's the prevailing narrative that its absence from the diet does not lead to a deficiency or to disease. And I would, from everything I understand about the bioenergetic view, it actually does lead to deficiency. It actually does lead to potentially disease. No, it leads, right? And ultimately, its inclusion in the diet, I believe, again, just from understanding the bioenergetic viewpoint, pro-metabolic viewpoint, is that its inclusion in the diet in large amounts will lead to growth and health beyond survival. So this is where I think it's misleading. And that's, I guess, what I'm kind of concerned about with respect to those who use this. And basically say, look, I can make all the glucose I need out of amino acids and protein. So why should I eat carbs? Carbohydrates are synthesized in the body, right? That's the question. So what would you, so let's take it there, right? Because that's essentially what this comes down to. I can,
Right.
I can create all the carbohydrate I need. I personally did it, right, for years. So why do I, right? Like, why do I need carbohydrates? Why not use protein to do so?
Yeah, and that is the next very important question, right? What is the cost of doing that? And again, just want to make it clear, we can say the same thing about fats, right? We can say the same about saturated and monounsaturated fats. And the same when we have gluconeogenesis, we have de novo lipogenesis. We can produce these ourselves. We have desaturase enzymes to convert the saturated to monounsaturated fats. There's no such thing as a deficiency of those because as long as we're eating enough other substrate or we have it stored, we can produce them. And so
Mm. I
it,
would argue, but I would argue that I would say the health effects of not eating fats as opposed to not eating carbs. I I think I think you can go a long way and feel pretty damn good eating just protein. What the long-term effect of that is a whole nother question. But if you go any length of time without eating fats, right? Like zero carbs, you can go quite a long way. Eat zero fats, and I think within I don't know what weeks you're gonna be crushed.
I mean, I think it's
What
pretty
do you
parallel. Not like,
think so?
yeah. So there's use
Okay,
cases for this too. Like there are a number of situations where very low fat diets, sub 10% are used for insulin resistance and diabetes. And we see,
okay,
people being able to get off of insulin. And, there's a number of those scenarios, not just like individual cases, but like, research
interesting.
on that.
Okay, fair enough.
Again, Denise Midra has a great article on that too, titled "In Defense of Low Fat," and there's
Okay,
the second part of that title
okay,
that I think is worth looking at. And anyway, like I think both come at a major cost. Neither are ideal. In the same way that people can get by on a low fat vegan diet. Again, I do think it comes at a cost health wise. And what if we did that, but with protein? Without decreasing protein, I think it would come at much less of a cost.
mm,
But I don't think either of them are the right question to ask. And I know you're not saying that. It's just an important kind of counter argument to bring up. But and that the real question, as you're saying, is what is the value of consuming these versus producing them endogenously? Like why, if we can produce all the saturated fat we need, or we can produce all of the carbohydrate we need, why consume these things? And
my bigger question is why consume carbohydrates uh, in any significant amount? Again, if we could just get them from protein and have the protein and get all the glucose we need, all the glucose that we assume we need, all the glucose that our brain needs. Um, Maybe we don't get the biggest pump in the gym, but I'd love to understand why this is a bad thing. Less so with the fats, but I mean, if you want to bring that up, that's fine. But I'm really interested in the carb piece.
yeah, and I know that, yeah, we'll focus on that. The only reason I bring that up is just because I think it is important to recognize, because both of us have been in that space of low carb, and when
Mhm.
you're and been at different levels of understanding physiology, obviously that evolves over time. And I think it's important to recognize the level with which we're exploring health and physiology and the type of argument that can persuade us. And I think we want to be careful about an argument like essentiality, which I think is a very weak stance for the consumption of anything.
Okay.
And so that's a general idea that I want to get at here. And again, when we're talking essentiality, we're talking normally, and this is how every vitamin mineral is determined to be essential, amino acids. Back in the 20s, 30s, early 1900s, we didn't know what all these different things were. We were just kind of isolating them. You would take it out and see, does this rat live or does it die? Like, can they survive without this thing? If they cannot, it must be essential. And that's how we have vitamin B1, and that's how we have zinc, and
Mhm.
that's how we have, quote, essential fatty acids and essential amino acids. But if you take fat away, they can survive. If you take carbs away, they can survive. Again, maybe minus the essential fatty acids. That's all we're talking about. It's
Hmm.
not a good argument for what we should be eating as in terms of our diet. That's the perspective that I was just trying to share.
Okay.
But in terms of the question of why eat carbs, there is an important shift that goes on metabolically when we're using fat as a fuel versus carbs as a fuel. And the availability of carbs is normally what determines this. If we're eating carbs, we'll be using a good amount of carbs as fuel. If we're not eating carbs, we'll be relying on fat as a fuel. If we don't eat anything, we'll be relying on fat as a fuel. And that's important because our bodies are constantly adapting to the inputs we're giving them, to the environment that they're in, so they can best survive and thrive and function in the environment we're providing. And in an environment without carbohydrates, this again can be anything from starvation to fasting, to just, those would be the two, and then just not eating carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
That acts as a signal essentially for a time when we want to be reducing our metabolic rate in the long term. And that's because when we talk about fat as our storage, right? We can store way more fat as carbohydrates. This is our good long-term storage, and that's great. And if we don't have food available, if we're under stress, we'll rely more and more on fat. And that's amazing. We need to have that. It's allowed us to be here. It allows us to survive during these times. But that doesn't mean that that is what leads to the best function that we can. And instead, what happens is when we're metabolizing mostly fat, because it is what we rely on during these stressful times, it provides it has biochemical effects and then causes hormonal signals that lower our metabolic rate. And this is a part of why it allows us to survive. When we're in a famine, we don't want to be running at max capacity because we will not survive very long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our fat stores that we have will last way less time. But instead, if we do slow down our metabolic rate and reduce how much energy we're expending, how much we're putting toward reproduction or immune function or brain function or skin and hair and nails or whatever it is, that allows us to exist for longer without food, right? We can survive for longer basically by going into a conservation mode, a low battery mode. And it's great that we have that.
Mm-hmm.
But as we're kind of getting at, if we rely on that, we're turning down our general metabolic functions. And the provision of carbohydrates does the opposite. It allows us to shift away from that backup fuel that we use in these stressful times. And that provides, again, both biochemical and hormonal signals that tell us the opposite. It tells us to increase our metabolic rate and increase the production and utilization of energy to increase the activity of our immune system, of our cognitive function, of reproduction, of skin health, and all of, and kind of on from there. And these signals first begin very, in the most basic fundamental way. Well, there's actually a couple, but I often like starting at what goes on in the mitochondria, where the difference between carbs and fats, there are very clear differing signals that play out in terms of the NADH to FADH2 ratio. And if you want me to not go in as deep, just let me know at any point, Lawrence.
It's all right. Go ahead.
I'll try to keep it brief, but essentially, this ratio is something that is the clearest thing that changes when we're burning fats as a fuel versus carbs.
Mm-hmm.
And it acts as a signal. It changes the way that we produce energy at the electron transport chain. And when we have this higher FADH2 to NADH ratio provided by fats, it lowers the NADH to NAD ratio, lowers the NAD to NADH ratio, which is the main driver of the rate of how fast this engine is running, basically how fast our mitochondria are running. And so when we're burning fat, it slows that down, which is great. We need that during certain times. When we're burning carbs, it speeds that up. That then has effects in terms of other hormones. So when we consume, let's say we're fasted and relying on our own provision of carbohydrates from gluconeogenesis, typically the hormonal state that we'll see is elevations in glucagon, especially, sometimes cortisol and epinephrine as well, and low insulin. And when we provide carbohydrates, we provide the opposite. The blood sugar gets provided by our diet instead of our gluconeogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
Insulin will come up, and those two things together directly turn down glucagon, adrenaline, or epinephrine, and cortisol. And those three hormones, which are typically regarded as stress hormones, because this is the same thing that happens whether we're under stress from exercise, whether we're under stress from fasting, or whether we're just not consuming carbohydrates, it's the same response. Or, smoking, or, any sort of different issues, but we'll come back to that. So when those things are elevated, they act as hormonal signals, which are just signals that tell our body we're in an environment that we want to slow things down in. And that happens by slowing the conversion of thyroid hormones. It slows down the conversion of T4 to T3. So we have less of the active thyroid hormone, which is our main metabolic regulator. We have less thyroid hormone production from the thyroid gland. We also have reductions, in testosterone production and other pro-metabolic hormone production. And these are seen again from each of those three hormones to different levels. Of course, cortisol is the most extreme, but
Hmm.
even with glucagon, we'll still see more minor or smaller effects here. And so we're basically shifting the whole metabolic state from one that's more in conservation mode, more in scarcity mode versus more of an abundant mode. And I would say that abundant mode is much more aligned with optimal health.
So makes sense. Let's talk about for a moment, since you've mentioned the slowing down of the metabolism at the mitochondrial level, which is really important if you want to, preserve life during starvation and environments where almost need to go into maybe hibernation to make it through tough times. So let's look at cancer, right? Because maybe the last thing, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe the last thing that we want in cancer, given that the cell converts to glycolysis, right? The mitochondria converts from oxidative phosphorylation to produce ATP. It uses glycolysis or fermentation, right? Which is a process that stems from the impaired ability to efficiently use glucose for ATP production. And so glucose is upregulated massively in glycolytic conditions because it's a much faster way of producing energy by converting the glucose into lactate, right? And then the lactate is used to fuel as the substrate for the cancer cell's growth. And, even worse, it's metastasization, right? It's spread throughout the body. So, and that's a very fast process, right? So now you have a ramped up metabolism, which can even lead to cachexia, right? In certain cases, when it completely spins out of control. However, I'd love to hear your thoughts then on the idea that actually slowing down the metabolism and using a ketogenic diet to do so would be a better approach than optimizing the cells by giving it more energy in the form of glucose, even though for a healthy cell, the proposition that the bioenergetic view is making is that no, that would actually be the healthiest thing to do. What are your give me your thoughts on that?
So what I'm going to say will sound controversial, but actually isn't in the research, which actually, I think is the case with a lot of these principles. But saying that sugar feeds cancer is 25% true. And what I mean by that is we're missing the other part of that statement, which is that sugar, amino acids, fatty acids, and ketones feed cancer. And so what we essentially have is a state where cancer is incredibly metabolically deranged, as you said, and trying to gobble up as much fuel as it can and grow as fast as it can. And it will convert glucose to lactate, and it actually uses that structurally, that lactate's used structurally, as opposed to just as its only way of producing energy. Because while it's doing that, it's running the Krebs cycle and it's running the mitochondria using amino acids and using fatty acids and ketones if we provide them. So mitochondria or cancer cells are hungry and they'll use everything we give them, and they're incredibly deranged. And so with that in mind, there's a couple of important pieces here. One is the idea that any fuel is going to produce cancer, I think, is missing the point, because cancer likes all these fuels. And if it was as simple as providing them causes cancer, then we would all have cancer just from existing, right? There's always fuel. The other piece there is the recognition of what is actually getting deranged in the cancer cell's metabolism. Then I think that's where we want to put our focus, as opposed to just trying to starve it out by reducing the things that feed it. So is it true that lowering fuel availability, just overall in the blood, less fatty acids, less glucose, less amino acids, would be would help to starve cancer out. Yes, hypothetically, it should slow its growth, although it is, of course, also coming at a cost to our bodies otherwise, which most things that are trying to remove cancer, stop its growth, kill it, do that too, right? The idea is generally let's kill the cancer and we're going to hurt ourselves, but we can survive it. And from that approach, yeah, reducing the availability of fuel is one way to do it and can be potentially effective. But I think if we can work toward trying to reverse the metabolic derangement in the first place, that would be my goal. Obviously, it gets really complicated when we've gotten to a point where we're already manifesting in some significant form of cancer. And at that point, we're throwing band-aids on, as opposed to something decades earlier that maybe we could help to prevent the process from occurring, or getting anywhere near that far. So what I would say, the real thing we want to work, in most cases, what we want to focus on is the prevention of that derangement. When it already gets to that place, we will probably have to do things that come at a cost. And ketogenic diet, I think, could be part of that. As you were saying, that it depends on the type of cancer. And it's worth noting as well, you mentioned metastasizing or metastasis, and that in a lot of states is associated with an increased rate of free fatty acid utilization and increased rates of autophagy and things like that we're trying to mimic and trying to encourage on a low carb diet. So we want to be careful just with this blanket assumption here. And I do think it's getting it borderline, is irresponsible to just say this is a sugar problem. So that's just a couple of points that I'll consider. Go ahead.
No, you're making great points. Again, when I ran into that study that my particular cancer used the autophagic process to supply substrate, I stopped all the fasting I was doing because I realized at that moment that, wait a second, I've been doing not only intermittent fasting, but I got to a point where I was doing I was doing 2 48-hour fasts every week, right? So I was getting into so I had the cancer 8 years ago that took my kidney. The cancer came back almost 2 years ago in my liver, and we took a chunk of my liver out. And I was fasting, trying to deal with that, right? And when I read that study, I was like, wait a second. Fasting ramps up, accelerates the autophagic process. So I stopped all fasting. And so the points you're making are correct. And if you cut off glucose, by the way, if you cut off carbohydrates, no problem. The cancer will just upregulate gluconeogenesis. And it'll get all the glucose it needs from amino acids. So you're exactly correct. Certainly, mitigating cancer and prevention is the best way to deal with it. But once you've got it, you're right. The prevalent idea is to kill the cancer without killing you. And who's going to survive, right? Who's going to outlive? Because the cancer will live if you take it out, right? You can keep it in a petri dish alive forever. But you won't live forever. So who's going to outlast who? That's the question. But I guess then, since we're on the ketogenic diet as one way of dealing with or managing cancer, because again, if there are, you might end up giving yourself you might go on a high fat ketogenic diet, and without doing the research, unwittingly fuel the cancer, because there are cancers that actually prefer, right, fatty acid metabolism to glucose metabolism, and then you're screwing yourself there. But since we're on the ketogenic diet, let's explore this now. Let's get into this, right? So considering the numerous benefits associated with the ketogenic diet, right? That lots of studies, lots of narrative, lots of influencers. I mean, it's hard to sort out what's right and what's not, but certainly there are studies, right? Effective weight loss, improved metabolic health, enhanced brain function, increased energy and focus, lack of the ever-present hunger that you have when you're eating a high-carb diet, So those are some of the advantages that people will tout about the ketogenic diet. And I will also have to admit that when I was on a high fat ketogenic diet in the beginning of my cancer journey, and I was on that for a while, my brain was firing like it never had before. I mean, it was unbelievable. Now that could be because I was coming off like a complete, like, just I ate a lot of carbs and fats and protein to excess, gluttonous to, right? Like, so it just might have been that, having thrown all of that out, that my brain was operating the way it should, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, it was clear that ketones were doing something that some would say are magical, but certainly were an enhancement. So what, so reconcile these advantages with your view that carbohydrates are a superior source of fuel, and that low carb let's just say ketogenic diets could actually be detrimental to health.
Mhm. Yeah, and as you're pointing out, it is, I would say, mixed bag, right? There are some clear benefits, not even outcome wise, but mechanistically, that I think are responsible for those outcomes. Yet at the same time, I think there are negatives that also come with and come at a long-term cost. And I think we can get the benefits without that cost. And just real briefly to come back to the cancer side, just wanted to mention there are, of course, in our case, or in your case, a very rare form that we're dealing with, but some of the more common ones, like different forms of breast cancer and prostate cancer and pancreatic cancer, things like that, there are a number of different ones where fatty acids fuel the growth, and increased fatty acid oxidation is a very clear indicator, and can actually increase metastasis and things like that. So
Right,
it's not like just this one really rare one. Glucose
right.
restriction wasn't the answer. This is large. I don't want to say fully universal, but a pretty, yeah, relatively universal presentation, or at least a piece of it, that's seen very clearly. And you also see chronic stress in cancer, often with lipolysis and ketogenesis and gluconeogenesis. You mentioned not wanting to produce, or not wanting to use amino acids to produce the glucose, which our bodies will do or cancer cells will signal for. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a huge part that drives the cachexia that you were mentioning too, as a feature there. And so with that in mind, I think if there were different ways that we could starve or kill the cancer, I'd probably like to do it without restricting our nutrition, right? Making sure we're providing enough fuel for ourselves so that we can get through that,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that the cancer is going to get it anyway. And we want to prevent something like cachexia for sure, which is a
Right.
huge, huge problem. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so in those instances, the dietary restrictions might not be the way to manage it. And you might want to look at, other solutions. There's
Mhm.
lots of potential solutions. I did a podcast on IP6, inositol hexaphosphate, over 100 studies. I had the professor that had conducted these studies on providing this nutrient, which comes from rice, actually, which has been shown to ameliorate certain types of cancer, and certainly has been shown to be massive anti-cancer nutrient. Maybe hyperbaric oxygen, putting stress on the system, right? That's non-nutrient based. So there's light therapy as well that they're looking at. There's sound therapy. There's lots of ways maybe. And then I thought to myself while we were talking, when you talk about giving something counterintuitively, when you talk about just restricting the fuel, one of the things they do with prostate cancer, we're getting off topic, but we'll make this quick. One of the big things about prostate cancer is that the fuel for prostate cancer is testosterone, right? I mean, they say, right, the hormone is feeding the cancer. And so one of the things that they do is that they cut off your testosterone, they chemically castrate you in order to slow the growth of the cancer. And the interesting thing is there are studies that are showing that super high amounts of testosterone are actually being shown to be effective in reducing the size of the tumor and managing the cancer, which is completely counterintuitive. And then I'm wondering, wait a second. So if you know, what if you threw, you know, what if you go on a high carb diet? You know, is it counterintuitive that actually that might be better for you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and so I mean, a couple other things. I think estrogen not only is a large player in prostate cancer or even precursors like prostatitis and enlargement, but also in most cancers as one of the main growth hormones, estrogen and stress hormones. So I think there's a piece of that there. And of course, testosterone can aromatize. And so that can potentially be maybe by reducing the testosterone helps, but maybe it's not as much of the.
So you're thinking it might be you're thinking it might be the estrogen. I know they found that men with low testosterone were actually more susceptible to prostate cancer because of what you're suggesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think estrogen is a culprit in a lot of them. And the other thing you see too is, speaking of the metabolic derangement you see it's typically the opposite of what happens in a person who is effectively using carbohydrates. For example, the NAD to NADH ratio that we were talking about is one of the clearest representations of our metabolism, right? When that is high, we have a good metabolism. When it's low, we don't. And in every degenerative state, you see a lower NAD to NADH ratio, and that
Mm.
includes cancer. And when we're looking at the nutrient differences, carbohydrates are the ones that increase that NAD to NADH ratio significantly relative to fats. And then what can happen, and this is where it gets complicated, and we'll talk about this as we now, I guess, transition to talking about keto pluses and minuses.
Mhm.
But when you use fat oxidation, there's increased reactive oxygen species production and reduced ATP production, which causes a stress reaction that then salvages NAD. So you end up with an okay NAD to NADH ratio as in the end, because you've initially caused a low one and then you get the high one after. But that is a kind of a defensive adaptive response that over time will lessen and lessen. So in the short term, it's okay, but long term, we see those negatives start to catch up.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Fascinating. Okay, so back to the ketogenic diet. What are so y- again, initially, uh, you go on this ketogenic diet and you're seeing a lot of benefits,
Mhm.
right? Um, and it's stark. It's like, you know, it's not like if you went on a low fat diet, high carb diet, I'm not sure you're going to see these stark, immediate benefits. But when you go on the ketogenic diet, there are some things that happen to you, which, you know, it's why a lot of it's termed magic. You know, like the magic pill documentary, and again, that mental clarity thing, it just is pretty incredible. So I guess the question is, okay, that's short term. What are the long-term detriments to health by being on a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, well, and so I think it's also worth highlighting how we get those short-term benefits, because as we'll get at, we can get those short-term benefits without a ketogenic diet. And I think
Okay.
that's ideal. And so I would say, I think four come to mind. We'll kind of see as we go through. The first is just changing our diet, which this is, I would say, common in the average person. And so it's worth mentioning. Any
Okay.
change diet wise can lead to benefits. And that's because the average person is coming from not caring about their diet, not trying to eat healthily. Whether they then go vegan, carnivore, keto, whatever it is, they will
Mhm.
typically see improvements early on and sometimes a lot of improvements. So it's worth mentioning.
Yep.
There's some other important physiological ones. One is going to be the relief from intestinal issues that cause endotoxin production. So we can come back to that.
Yep.
The other is going to be relief from poor glucose oxidation. So, as an example, if our brains are running on glucose, but we're not using that glucose so well, metabolically, we're, let's say, running at 80%, we're not going
Mhm.
to be feeling as good mentally, cognitively. And if we then switch to using something like ketones over the glucose, then we can be back up at 100%. We haven't fixed our ability to use the glucose, but we've provided a different fuel that doesn't have the same issue. And so now we're feeling better because we've taken a fuel away that we don't use well and provided a good one. As we'll get at, my preference would be fix the ability to use the glucose, but we can come back to that.
Mhm.
So that would be I think those two are kind of the most prominent. Oh, and then the last one that I do think is worth mentioning, and this is the case with any sort of stressful intervention, whether we're talking a cold plunge or a fast or ketogenic diet, and that is stress hormones. Stress hormones feel really good when we have our cup of coffee on an empty stomach. That can power us through the day and feel our
Mm,
brain turn on, and we're running at full capacity. When we get in the cold plunge and that causes our body a lot of stress, we get huge dumps of adrenaline and norepinephrine and all of that. Our
right.
brains turn on, we feel good, we feel ready to take on the day. But we're basically taking out a loan when we do that. And that's a loan that we do have to pay back in the long term. So that is kind of a bit of an insight to the next side, which is the negatives.
So what is that deficit that we're pulling from, and what is the long-term payback look like? What happens?
So,
So and I'll mention a few things later on as we round out that I've experienced. But if you're on a ketogenic diet uh, for 10 years, what are you likely to start noticing?
yeah. So, well, what ends up happening is we've been taking out loans as we go. What happens when we're not providing the carbohydrates, not providing enough fuel, that our bank account, is going down, and we put some charges on our credit cards, or we take out loans so that we can get by in the meantime. And it feels fine. No issue to us,
Yep.
until it doesn't, until we have to start paying back that debt. And that's the same thing that we talked about when we first started, which is our bodies are reading that balance and over time saying this isn't going to work. Like long term here, something's going to have to be cut. We have to cut some expenses, because otherwise we're going to keep racking up debt and we won't be able to keep surviving, just like a long term fast. And so it starts to cut those expenses, right? We start to cut the amount of energy that we provide for our hair, skin, and nails, things that aren't so important. We start to cut eventually more intense things, right? Our immune function. We kind of have to let some things pass, because we can't expend all this. We can't provide enough money for those expenses right now. We have to worry about our heart beating and walking to whatever we're doing, maybe our workouts that we're forcing some extra expenditure for.
Mhm.
And then we'll see the same thing with the reproductive function as well. That's something that tends to go, because our bodies are saying this is not a good time to be even barely be surviving, let alone trying to support another human, the growth of another human by reproduction. So that is another one that starts to go down. And so we see this present hormonally. We tend to see testosterone lower over time. We tend to see definitely lower T3. Oftentimes we won't see the classic hypothyroid high TSH, because that'll be suppressed by cortisol. So that's kind of like a deeper suppression of the thyroid activity.
Mhm.
But another thing too, when we're running on stress, it makes it really hard to relax a lot of times. Just like after, if we've had some coffee and we're jittery, and that can lead to anxiety. It can lead to trouble sleeping and insomnia, which again, we might not feel tired from it early on because we've got the stress hormones to keep us going. But over time, we'll probably start to feel tired and we won't be able to actually physiologically relax. And that'll lead to trouble sleeping. So those are some of the really common symptoms, lower libido, lower energy, trouble focusing. Eventually, some digestive symptoms can start to come up as the depending on where our digestive state is at, but also considering that we're putting a lot less energy toward digestion, we tend to see much slower motility and decreases there. So that's like the kind of long term ramifications that we'll see from continually taking out these loans.
Okay. That, you know, I think resonates in a major way. I think those are things that most people do not consider when they go on the ketogenic diet, because again, it's all short term, and most people can't last anyway on the ketogenic diet. All right, but there are some hardcore people out there. I lasted on it for years. I lasted on carnivore for years, um, and and a number of things you're saying are true, right? Like I've experienced some of this, and we'll talk about that. Um, I've heard you say, if I've got this correct, I've heard you say that a high protein, low carb diet is worse then I think I've heard you say this, is worse than a ketogenic diet. And I'm curious as to why that is, because the thing that I know what actually you're going to get into here, but a high protein low carb diet with not high fat, so it's not really ketogenic. Maybe you're seeing ketones at 0.8 millimolar. Let's say that's the highest. Or you're certainly not seeing 1.5, 2, 3 ketones in the blood. If you're on a high protein, you're gonna be getting a lot of glucose from the gluconeogenesis that you won't be getting with a ketogenic diet. So you're going to get your glucose spikes, and you're not going to get all that fatty acid metabolism. And let's face it, what I found as well, and we'll get into this, there's the increase in lipids in the blood. So why is a high protein, low carb diet worse than a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, essentially what I would say is we get the stress quicker and more intensely. And I think we've seen this a lot, where the number of people going from carnivore to adding carbs back in and the amount of time it's taken has been a lot. Like, there's a lot more people doing that a lot, and it's happening a lot quicker versus the ketogenic diet. And I've seen this a lot with clients too. I mean, I've worked with the people who have been on the ketogenic diet for 5+, 10+ years, or then
Okay.
switched to carnivore and started to see those issues come up even further. But sometimes even just the long term on keto and seeing these issues present. But essentially, what happens is when we shift over fully to keto and we're mostly just on fat and ketones, we do slow our metabolic rate down. So that those expenses are reducing, and so we're not taking out as big of a loan. We're not relying as much on stress. When we're instead, it's almost like, and I don't want to get too much on the money analogy because it's going to get too far away, but it's almost like a mortgage on a house versus a credit card loan or credit card debt, where on carnivore, because we are not relying as much on the fats and we're relying more on the protein conversion to carbohydrate through gluconeogenesis, we're not providing the signal as strongly to turn our metabolism down, yet still relying on higher amounts of stress hormones for that conversion of protein to carbs. So instead of having like the full hibernation mode that we can get by on longer, we're in more of like we're less hibernating. We're kind of, it's this combination of higher stress plus hibernation, and that tends to present with symptoms sooner.
And is there, as I understand it, you get an increased ammonia production, and that's an issue? Is that?
Yeah, you do. So that reliance on gluconeogenesis is very stressful at the liver. It does lead to excess ammonia production, which comes at a cost, and also is much more inefficient, I would say, right? So in order to produce ATP all the way from amino acids to glucose, we lose out on about 30% of the total ATP we would produce if we were just getting it from glucose. And so it's a very heavily disfavored process, and it requires large amounts of glucagon in order to trigger it. And it's just viewed as in the same way that, when we think about fuel sources, fat and carbs are really our primary fuel sources, and protein shouldn't be. It's supposed to be more
Right.
structural. And so we're essentially just providing less fuel and forcing ourselves to create fuel out of a less efficient fuel source. And so it ends up being worse off.
Gotcha. Um, so all right. So bioenergetic diets and Ray Peat's recommendations often emphasize the inclusion of sugars, right? Which carbohydrates is one thing, right? Like there was like I've been in the bodybuilding scene for a long time, and this space for a long time. The slow carb thing was big for a while, right? Slow carbs,
Yeah.
right? Remember that? The slow carb, right? And um, so carbohydrates are one thing, but if you're into fitness and health, and especially in the alternative health space, you make a distinction between carbs and sugars,
Mm-hmm.
right? You got your complex carbs, you got your starches, right? Your fibrous starches, and you got your simple sugars, and they can do different things. You can use them different ways. But and certainly you've recommended this as well, emphasizing the inclusion of sugars as a large part of your carbohydrate intake. Sugars from honey, white sugar, right, juice, and fruit, as being a substantial portion of the diet. For instance, Ray Peat reportedly consumed more than 1,600 calories a day, equating to about 400 grams of carbs from sugar, right? If I read this correctly, he used to drink 2 quarts of orange juice every day. So that's mind blowing to someone coming from, you know, a low carb world and starting to incorporate carbs back. Given studies that indicate that low doses of fructose, under 1 gram per kilogram, are nearly completely metabolized by the small intestine, you should be okay. But you know, beyond, let's say, like if I weigh 150 pounds or 155 pounds, and I'm doing the math on that, like if I get into anything above 70 grams of fructose, for instance, you know, that studies showing there's significant spillover to the liver. So a couple things. How do you reconcile, forget about carbs. Let's move away from complex carbs and carbohydrate. Let's talk about sugar. How do we reconcile, first talk sugar, being good for you? It's supposed to be the most evil thing in the world, right? How is sugar, like table sugar, good for you? And then we can get into fructose.
I had to start with the most extreme one.
Yeah, I have that. Let's
Yeah,
make
no,
it hard.
yeah, well, yeah. So I will say, when I first came across the bioenergetic view and came across Ray Peat, I was in that camp, right? It's one thing to say maybe carbs are okay. You know, I get
Mhm.
having some rice on workout days or something. I can get on board with that, but there's no way that I'm going to be eating fructose and sugar, right? And so I started off with a very low fructose, high carb diet,
Okay.
and benefited so much when I switched over to one that was largely sugar based from juice and fruits and honey, maple syrup, table sugar.
Wow.
So there are, first thing I'll say, just again, kind of getting rid of some of the arguments that are, I think, the equivalent to the essentiality argument we were having earlier, or like
Mhm.
that you brought up earlier with carbs being essential, fats being essential.
Mhm.
I think the equivalent one with sugar is there's no nutritional value. And the sugar, when we demonize something, we then point at all of its flaws, but we forget to then provide the same rigor when we look at our own, you know, consumption of what we're doing as opposed to whatever we're demonizing. So as an example, any fat that we're consuming is largely devoid of nutrients as well. Whether you're consuming coconut oil, MCT oil, olive oil, which sure has a bit of vitamin E in it, butter, which, yeah, you'll have a little bit of fat soluble vitamins in there. For the most part, and especially if we take something like MCTs or coconut oil where it's very clear, but for the most part, there's maybe a little bit of fat soluble vitamins, but nothing that actually helps with energy production anyway, all the B vitamins and minerals that you need. So whether you're consuming 100 grams of fat from MCT oil or coconut oil versus the equivalent, which would be what, 180 grams or so of carbohydrates from sugar, from white table sugar, you're not getting any nutrients with either, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, when we're talking 400 calories of either, whatever, 900 calories, whatever it ends up being, we want to treat everything with that same rigor. So yes, table sugar does not have any nutrients, and that's a valid concern sometimes. It's good to have nutrients, I'm not saying that, but not
Mhm.
every single thing we eat needs to be packed with nutrients, and it never is, right? Our fuel sources are very rarely packed with nutrients. Actually, when you compare carbs and fats, most carb sources are way more nutrient dense than pure fat sources. It's just that normally the fat comes with protein and the protein sources have a lot of nutrients, right?
Fair enough.
So anyway, that's just the first thing. The nutrient problem, I think, it's kind of a scapegoat. It's just way overemphasized. We eat lots of things without a lot of nutrients, and that's okay as long as we're getting those nutrients in our diet overall.
Okay.
So at that point, we're just talking about fuel versus fuel, right? Glucose and fructose versus versus fat. And the, we talked about, I guess, the differences between the metabolism of each, where the carbohydrates, whether it's starting as glucose or starch or fructose that's getting converted in, they will be burned at a faster rate in our mitochondria relative to fats. And I would, in general, say that that's ideal. It's closer to ideal and less reactive oxygen species production and all of that. So that's just kind of a starting place. I think I would also say, as we talked about earlier, one thing that was so overwhelmingly influent had such an influence on me and so many people when they first start bringing carbs in is the recognition of how directly it opposes stress. So we talked about this earlier. If we're under high levels of glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol, the best way we can turn that off, and what happens immediately when we consume some quick digesting carbs, is the blood sugar goes up, insulin goes up, and it turns those hormones down directly. And recognizing that we can immediately change the way that we feel just by consuming some carbohydrates, I think is it's just overwhelming. It's such an important recognition, and we see this in research too, where there's some studies where what they'll do is they'll introduce something that is an allergen to rats to the point where it'll cause anaphylactic shock and death. And then they have these rats at different levels of blood sugar and different levels of insulin.
Mhm.
And what they find is as they increase the blood sugar level, the effect of this allergen decreases.
Hmm.
And to a point where when the blood sugar is kept high enough, not only is there no anaphylactic shock and no death, but there's nearly no symptoms at all, compared to in the group with lower blood sugar where the rats will die. Which just shows us how important it is to have this sort of fuel on board and how anti-stress it can be, how much it can protect us against things that we're faced with, any sort of energy demand that we're faced with, whether it's an allergen or running or a thought process or detoxification at the liver or whatever it is. So I think broad picture wise, those are just some general thoughts. But the real concern, I think, the other side of it, forget or we've talked about the nutrient side, is, as you were saying, the fructose side, right?
Hmm.
Glucose is maybe okay, but fructose, that one is it's basically toxic. It's basically poison. It's going to directly be converted to fat, especially in the liver, which is the last place you want any fat. And it's going to cause insulin resistance as a result of that or alongside
Right.
that. And I think that's the next area that's important to touch on.
Yes, absolutely. So before we jump on that, just to wrap up, yes, it'll alleviate the stress hormones, uh, but won't keeping the blood sugar level high through the consumption of quick absorbing carbs in the form of sugars. Won't that cause insulin resistance? Won't that cause diabetes?
Yeah, and that's a larger conversation. Um, but the short answer is I would say no. So there's a couple things that are really important to consider. We have this idea that we are either not eating carbs or we are chronically having high levels of insulin and blood sugar. And that is a false dichotomy. The reality is, if we're insulin sensitive and eating a lot of carbohydrates, we
Mhm.
still have low levels of insulin and we still have typically low levels of hemoglobin A1C, low levels of blood sugar. Yes, it goes up as a transport vehicle, just like free fatty acids and other lipids go up when we're relying on fat as a fuel, which also is a feature of diabetes, by the way. But so, yes, there's increased fuel in the blood when we're consuming more of that type of fuel, but it's temporary because our tissues take it up and use it. And we
Mm.
see that clearly in the healthy populations that are eating lots of carbohydrates. They're still extremely insulin sensitive and they have very low fasting insulin. They don't have cardiovascular disease. They don't have hypertension. A really good example of this is the Ketavans, which eat a high saturated fat or who eat a high saturated fat and high carbohydrate diet, very
Mhm.
high carbohydrate. Like I want to say 70+% of their calories are from
Wow.
carbs,
Okay.
and they're the most insulin sensitive population we know of, right? You give them glucose for a glucose tolerance test and their blood sugar barely changes and their fasting insulin levels are like 4, and their diseases are absent. So the idea that it is either low carb to keep your glucose low and your insulin low, or they're chronically high is not the reality, right? I'm not saying we want to have chronically high glucose and insulin. That's not a glucose problem. It's actually a metabolic problem where we're not using the glucose well, which is what you're getting at with the insulin resistance.
Right.
But that's not, we don't want that. I'm with you. We don't want chronically high
Right.
levels there because that's a sign of pathology. That's not an ideal situation. That's a situation where we're eating the carbs, but we're not using them, right?
Right.
Our the mitochondria aren't working well. There's blockages. Our cells are taking up the glucose, but they aren't converting it to energy. And we end up with higher levels in the blood and a reaction to that, which is elevated levels of insulin to try to keep stress hormones down, free fatty acids down, and increase glucose utilization and uptake.
Right. But it's not the sugar that's causing that. It's the inability to use the sugar properly. And I highly implore people to listen to your podcasts on this, because I think that's where we get into, I believe, glucagon being the potential real culprit there. But let's move that aside, because I want to use what time we have to just a few more things. I probably could ask you 100 questions. We could be on for 10 hours. So now to the fructose piece. So the spillover out of the small intestine, I believe, where it can be dealt with, up to what they've seen, that fructose up to 1 gram per kilogram of body weight will not even hit the liver, and it'll be dealt with and metabolized in the intestine. But that there is significant spillover beyond that. And then when the liver gets hit with, I mean, if you're, and I'm just looking at Ray Pete, right? If you're getting all of your carb sources from, or even yourself, right, from fructose, because it's coming from the honey, it's coming from the fruit, and it's coming from the fruit juice. I doubt you're sitting there gobbling, 100 grams of table sugar every day, right? It's coming from honey, it's coming from fruit, it's coming from fruit juice. Don't you have not NAFLD right now? Don't you don't you have super high ALT and AST levels? What's going on?
Right, right. Yeah, no, they're all fine. I have had them checked recently. And by the way, what was that, Lawrence?
No, okay, good. No, by the way, good.
By the way, I've had numerous clients with very high ALT, AST levels with fatty liver disease diagnosed from scans, and we've been able to reverse it while still consuming a lot of fructose. And not only just fructose, but from juices and the worst quote unquote sources.
Okay, well, that's shocking. So the spillover into the liver, the hit on the liver from fructose, and I'm not saying high fructose corn syrup, unless the next thing you're about to say to me is, no, that's fine as well. But just like table sugar is okay, and that makes sense. Everything you've said makes sense so far. But just address the spillover to the liver and that not being an issue.
Yeah. And I would say I prefer table sugar over high fructose corn syrup. There's heavy metal contamination concerns and things like that.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so a couple of things that are important to say. For one, when we're talking about fructose sources, they're typically about 50-50 glucose to fructose, whether we're looking at honey, table sugar, fruits, juices. Normally it's about 50-50. There is variation. There are a couple of exceptions, but normally it's about that. And that's really important because the entire idea that we're operating from is, when it comes to this idea that fructose increases de novo lipogenesis at the liver, right? We're producing fat from it, and it's therefore causing fatty liver disease, and it's causing inflammation at the liver. It's not one of those things where we just the idea is like, we looked at what happened in people, we have this view of their physiology, we give them fructose, and we see exactly what happens. What actually happens is, kind of like we were talking about with the essentiality studies, is we're drawing inferences based on research. And in this case, the research that underlies this idea that fructose increases fat production at a high level in the liver is not based on a normal way that a human consumes sugar. Typically, this is based on rat data, rat studies, where they're using pure fructose on its own without glucose. And that's very, very important, because we never encounter pure fructose or really anything too far outside of a 50-50 ratio of glucose to fructose in nature. And we don't absorb fructose on its own very well. The receptor that's used to absorb fructose requires glucose. And so we need them together to be able to absorb them. And when we give pure fructose, especially to a
Mm,
rat, humans are even much better at dealing with pure fructose than rats, and we'll get to that. But when we provide pure fructose, what actually happens is not that much of it gets directly absorbed. Some percentage does, but a large amount of it can't get absorbed. And so it goes down and feeds bacteria, which produce LPS, which is a lipopolysaccharide and is also known as endotoxin. Endotoxin is directly toxic, not only to the liver, but to our entire bodies. It's responsible for sepsis and causes death with severe infection. It's nasty, like one of the most ubiquitous poisonous things that we're exposed to on a regular basis. It's used universally in research to create inflammation. And so this endotoxin production from the gut causes huge amounts of inflammation at the liver and causes the conversion of any fuel, including fructose, but also glucose and fatty acids, into triglycerides because it directly blocks our ability to produce energy from the fuel like our liver normally would. So, and and this is shown so clearly, it's really, again, such a disservice that we're told something like fructose
right.
equals fatty liver, because all they have to do in these studies is give the rats antibiotics so that they don't have bacteria, and the fatty liver goes away even when they feed them pure fructose.
Wow.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. So we are here's the reality of what happens when we consume fructose that we actually absorb, right?
Mhm.
That is alongside glucose. Most of it, so it depends on the amount, but let's say we're just talking about absorption, we're not even talking about feeding the small, the cells of the lining of the intestine.
Okay.
So let's just look at all the fructose that goes to the liver. Most of it is going to be converted to glycogen and stored. Our liver has a great capacity for storing glycogen, and it's using that all the time.
Okay.
On average, we could say about 100 grams, but a healthy liver can store considerably more. So that's the first place it'll go. Second place is it'll be oxidized for energy production. Our livers are actually more energy demanding gram for gram than any other organ, I believe. The brain outcompetes it in total amount of energy utilization. Or actually, no, I think it's the other way around. The brain is more energy hungry gram for gram, but the liver uses more total energy because it's a larger organ. I believe that's what it is. They're very close anyway. Um, so the liver is extremely metabolically active and will use that fructose to produce ATP. And then the other thing is a pretty large portion will get converted to other forms of carbohydrate and sent out into the blood. So it'll get converted to glucose and sent out into the blood, or converted to lactate and sent out into the blood, both of which can be taken up by muscles and other organs and the brain to produce energy. Those are the pathways that are largely favored. Basically, 99% of the fructose that goes to the liver will go through one of those pathways. About 1% on average will be converted to fat. That is very, very little when we're talking about total fructose. And that does not mean that you will increase your fat stores by that amount every time. What that just means is that will be stored as fat. And then that fat store, just like any other, there's always constant flux, right? The amount of fat that we consume that goes to our adipose tissue is significant. That doesn't mean we gain fat every time we eat fat. There's always flux in and out.
Right.
So that is the typical presentation, and that's different from rats. And it's so distinct that, again, even forgetting the absorption, just looking at liver enzyme activity, ours are so much more metabolically active than rats that there's research basically saying that we shouldn't be using rats as any sort of indication of what goes on in humans when it comes to fructose intake because they're so much less metabolically active. And that's basically because our liver not only is a major detoxification organ, but it's also a major storage organ for the rest of our body in terms of carbohydrates and specifically our brain. And our brains are much more metabolically active, much more important compared to a rat's brain. And so our liver's improved capacity kind of goes hand in hand with that. And so in order to actually create any significant amount of de novo lipogenesis from fructose in rats too, but also in humans, it
Hmm.
requires massive overfeeding, massive amounts of fructose intake. And it's just nowhere near the the narrative that we're told.
And it's got to be pure fructose.
Yes, or if it's not pure fructose, you need to be doing massive overfeeding. I mean, there is a study where they're actually using a balance of carbs, both glucose and fructose, and they have to be feeding like 650 grams of carbohydrates and added fat as well. So there's one study in particular I'm talking about. They basically, and these are in athletes, but it was athletes or at least people who are active, weighing 165 pounds, and they brought them up from 2,700 calories to 4,500,
Hmm.
and that was increasing both carbs and fat. And at that point, they got up to 3 grams a day of de novo lipogenesis at the liver.
Wow.
Not very much. So
No.
And I don't even, I don't think those were necessarily athletes. I think they just had them glycogen deplete to start, and then they had them on that diet for several days. But in any case, it's nothing like what we're told.
Just busting myth after myth here. Okay. So to round this out, because I know we're running out of time and I'm leaving a lot of questions on the table. Um, Getting back to where I left off when I first set the table with you and told you what led me to find you. I stopped fasting when I found that study. I started adding carbs back into my diet in the form of fruit. And I went from just eating some strawberries and keeping my carbs to, under 20 grams. I started to dramatically increase that. And I did so through the use of honey. And I did so through the use of fruit, primarily apples and pears.
Mm.
And so, we know something started popping up on my blood work because I get monitored, right? Even though it's been 8 years, I'm constantly monitored. Every 4 to 6 months, I get scans, and I get blood work once a month. And we noticed all of a sudden that there was a jump in my liver enzymes, ALT and AST. ALT had gone from, and I had recovered from the liver surgery where they took out a chunk of my liver, right, with the tumor that had been there a couple of years ago. And they took my gallbladder as well. So I had recovered from like absurd, like the numbers after a liver surgery, you can imagine like ALT was like almost 900, AST was like 600 and something. Came all the way back down. AST came back to normal. ALT came almost back to normal, which is great. Boom, all of a sudden they're up. My ALT's at 100, 120. What is going on? And it was one of two things. It was either because I take no drugs, I drink no alcohol, I eat very clean. So I thought, what's going on? What's different? So it was either absurdly a foot medication I was taking, the only medication I've ever taken, because I have a plantar's wart, and they gave me a foot cream. I'm a big proponent of researching everything you put in your body. Who would ever think you should look up the side effects of a foot cream? Turns out they gave me a skin cancer medication to treat a plantar's wart. And it's an immunotherapy. And one of the side effects of being on that is altered liver function. And I immediately went off it. I was only on it a few weeks, and so it should have resolved. But my ALT and AST just kept going higher. What is going on? So then I started thinking, maybe it's the fructose. I was eating about, if I put it into context, I'm eating about 8 pieces of fruit a day coming from apples and pears. And I'm eating probably 2 tablespoons worth of honey. Now, here's a question for you that I think a lot of people would have. Certainly your clients coming off of long-term ketogenic diets. And I will tell you, when I first went on the ketogenic diet, one of the things I noticed was massive uptick in adrenaline surges. I would get constant, like if something would startle me, massive adrenaline surge. I became a lot calmer, right, when I moved on to carnivore and came out of a high-fat diet. Carnivore suited me a lot better. And I did great on carnivore for quite a while. And one of the things we also noticed was I might be one of these, what do they call them? Lean mass hyper-responders,
Yeah.
right? So you'll see in the blood work that my LDL is 300, but my triglyceride to HDL ratio is 2 HDL to 1, right? So I'm typical lean mass hyper-responder. And so potentially that's just the substrate, the fatty acid being shuttled to my cells for energy because I'm not getting any carbohydrate. but anyway, so my question for you is, can being on a long-term, no carb, low carb diet, ketogenic carnivore, put you in a position where your body no longer understands how to utilize fructose or carbohydrates effectively initially, and that maybe there's a ramp up time, because I smashed it, literally went from no carbs to all fructose and probably getting in 100 grams of fructose a day when I hadn't, I've been off that for almost 7 years. So what are your thoughts?
So there is often an adjustment period. However, the increased liver enzymes is not normally something I would see there. Not that it's never, but I think in this case we might have a different explanation. So I mentioned earlier, pretty much all of our sugar sources are about 50-50 in nature. There are some exceptions.
Okay.
The main ones, as far as fruits that have a much higher fructose to glucose ratio, are mangoes and then apples and pears. So, as far as the harder to digest, oh, and then watermelon too.
Okay.
So, as far as the harder to digest fruits go, apples and pears are very high on that list. Not to mention, they also are very high in other fermentable carbohydrates outside of fructose. They have
Mm-hmm.
sugar alcohols in there that we don't digest.
Mm.
And so, what that means is, of all the fruits, you picked a couple that are most likely to be feeding bacteria. Now, if we have a really good, healthy microbiome that is already adjusted and used to getting some carbohydrate, that might not be an issue. But it's really common for something like that to cause increases in endotoxin, which can cause the increased liver enzymes. So, my first assumption would be that if we switched over to lower fermentable carbohydrates or lower fermentable fruits
Mm-hmm.
with a pretty even fructose to glucose ratio, we should be fine. So I would test that first before looking at anything else, before trying to reduce the fructose or something like that, because I think that's a really likely culprit.
So it's really interesting. So, based on your work, right? Because I've dived into, all of your work, and uh, it's your recommendation that, that I learned that apples and pears have that much higher fructose to glucose ratio. And so I switched up, um, based on what I read, that, from your articles and your podcasts, and switched to a much more favorable ratio from mandarins, pineapple, uh, and I've also started adding, instead of getting it all from fructose, I started adding sweet potato to my diet. Also rice, white rice, which, may or may not, maybe because of phytate, but I don't know if that's really an issue. Certainly not a fructose situation. Um, and but so with that said, um, I only just recently made that switch, but we keep seeing the liver enzymes climbing. The ALT is now at like 350. The AST is at like 180 or something like that. And I'm seeing, just so we're clear, I'm seeing a hepatologist, and we've done a bunch of blood tests. We also see super high ferritin. Ferritin is at like almost 900.
Mm.
This could be the cause. Potentially, super high ferritin being stored, iron being stored in the liver, could be causing this issue. So
Was it already high prior, or was that new?
we didn't, we just start that, we never all of the tests I've ever done, we never tested for iron. The hepatologist ordered that.
Mm.
All my other iron markers are normal. It's just the ferritin that they're seeing is high. It's just the ALT and AST. All the other liver markers are normal. There's all the hepatitis tests came back normal. Everything you can think of came back normal. And so we're either at this change I've made in the amount of fructose that I'm eating is going to show up as, alleviating some of this on my next blood test, which I'm doing over the weekend. Or if that doesn't change over the next few weeks, I am scheduled for a liver biopsy, which I've been putting off and trying to manage this without having to do a liver biopsy. So we'll see this weekend. If my liver enzymes have come down, then it could be an indication that it's the fructose. When I first crazily, I came off the apples and pears, and my liver enzymes went massively back down from like 280 to ALT went from 280 to 80. And I was like, I figured it out. Jay Feldman was right. It's the high fructose that's what it was. And so, I came off yeah, and that was fine. I thought, man, I figured it out. This is amazing. Went back up. And then, so that's what we're trying to figure out now what that is. So again, I've pushed out a lot of the fructose I was eating. I'm only eating, like I said, I'm eating some mandarins every day. But I'm getting most of my carbs now from rice and sweet potato. Let's see what my liver enzymes look like over the weekend. But if not, the only thing that's left that they think it might be is an autoimmune issue, an autoimmune liver issue, which may have come up out of absolutely nowhere, but I think it might have been triggered by the immunotherapy foot cream I was given. That's the possibility.
Maybe, but there's if going off the apples and pears made a big difference, I think something like that is less likely. So here's some general thoughts. Firstly is I would really want to minimize fermentable carbohydrates. Knowing that we're coming from low carb, this is, I think, the biggest area where people see issues is higher FODMAP, like higher fermentable carbohydrate-based fruits. And then that can also, it doesn't classically, but I think that can also or should also include starch. So I have a number of issues with the idea of FODMAPs. On one hand, I like the general perspective, but as far as some of the specifics go, I think there's some things missing and some things there that shouldn't be there. One of the things that I think is missing is starch. So in the same way we could have issues breaking down certain forms of carbohydrates like lactose, let's say, especially when we haven't had starch for a long time, we can have less amylase and have trouble breaking down the starch. That is something that's also associated with hypothyroidism and intestinal overgrowths, like bacterial overgrowths. So if we're coming from low carb, I would be very careful with starches.
Okay.
And by the way, when I first started bringing carbs in and went glucose only, low fructose, I was adding mostly starches and had a lot of symptoms as a result of that, and digestive based symptoms and serotonin and things like that. So I would be really careful with starch, and I'd be really careful with the highly fermentable fruits like apples or watermelon or mangoes, like we were saying. So I would want to start with, again, easiest to digest ones. Mandarins are a great option. Pineapple's a very good option. A lot of those other fruits, maybe even a bit of juice. And I would say the easiest or like best test here to make sure it's not the fructose and it is gut related is we just have a lot of juice, like orange juice, that shouldn't feed. There should really be no scenario where that's feeding bacteria, but it's still a lot of fructose, and that should help us rule it out. I know we can't do that before this weekend, but that would be one of my thoughts to identify as this fructose or endotoxin. As I was saying, I would hesitate with the sweet potatoes and rice. I've just seen too many times where those do contribute to endotoxin production.
Wow.
So
very interesting.
Even though they're not classically considered fermentable carbohydrates. I mean, there's some in the sweet potatoes, but so that would be my first thought. Now, you also mentioned, what if there's just an adaptation period? And there's also the possibility that in our case, we're dealing with a liver that's not functioning at 100%. We don't even have 100% to function.
Right.
And so maybe that adaptation period would be even more of a consideration for us. And maybe we do have to be more careful with how much fuel is coming in. And I wouldn't rule that out, but I would make sure we rule out endotoxin first. That would be my preferred order of operations. And I would love to be able to do more testing before going for a biopsy, but obviously you have to do what you have to do what you have to do. But what I would say on that front is things that are not uncommon are seeing blood sugar come up initially, A1C come up initially, sometimes a shift in lipids where triglycerides come up initially. But that's to be expected as we are shifting over our fuels. There could be that kind of adaptation period, and then those things would come back down. So that, I think, is not uncommon. Seeing as big of a spike in the liver enzymes as we saw doesn't sound like it's necessarily that. But as I was saying, we're not dealing with a liver that's necessarily functioning at 100% plus super high ferritin, which means we're really prone to oxidative stress, which is a primary culprit behind the conversion of fructose to triglycerides and also all the inflammatory things going on at the liver. So, and also, by the way, high iron and cancer often go hand in hand
Yes,
too.
that's
And
something that, yeah, I'm very aware of that.
yeah,
And it's actually a driver of the cancer that I have.
and it's not the first time that I've seen that in a client with cancer and very, very high ferritin. And I think it's such a disservice that that's not looked at in that medical world, that medical space. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's underappreciated, and also plays a role with fatty liver disease and increased liver enzymes and things like that. So we might be at a case where, again, it's possible we just might not be able to handle as much fructose as ideally we will long term. So I wouldn't rule that out, but I would want to test out the endotoxin piece first, if possible. Obviously, we have to do what we have to do. But
Amazing stuff. We could go on for hours. Jay, I think we're at time. I know you've got another call that you've got to do. Where can our audience find you and learn more about all the great information and knowledge that you're putting out?
yeah, so the place I'd like to direct listeners, we talked about carbs versus fat, we talked about bioenergetic approach, talked about some of these things with possible issues we can have with different types of foods. And so I've tried to help shortcut all of those things by putting together the Energy Balance Food Guide. It's a one-page infographic, lists foods in terms of how well they support our metabolism, how likely they are to contribute to endotoxin production and cause gut issues if we're susceptible to that. And it's available for free on my website at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. So I think that's a really great place to start. And then on my website, I also have free articles and links to the podcast, which is called the Energy Balance Podcast, and all the other resources that I offer and services and things like that.
Amazing, amazing. Jay, thank you so much for doing this show. Ton of great information. Got to have you back on again. Have a great, great day. This is the Alpha Human Podcast. We're out.
Thanks for having me, Lawrence. And I'd be happy to come back on. So invite me on
Awesome.
again.
Awesome. Thank you.